A lovely early September day in the Scottie Phillip Memorial Cemetery on the banks of the beautiful Missouri River, basically at the edge of what was part of his world-famous Buffalo Ranch. And Scottie wanted to have a cemetery plot for his family, children, relatives, and he took this piece of land because he thought the view was lovely and made it for the Scottie Phillip family. Scottie Phillip came to he was born in Scotland into a large family, came to the United States at the age of 15, went to a small Scottish settlement in Kansas, discovered that he didn't think that was really where he wanted to be, and got gold fever, came to the Black Hills, was run out by the Army a couple of times, then fell in as the Indian situation was trying to be resolved, found a place for himself at Fort Robinson in northwest Nebraska, became a freighter, someone who would herd cattle up for the Native Americans, and he ultimately, because he married Sarah Larrabee, who had American Indian blood, they then came from Fort Robinson up into this area where he was going to start a ranch. So that's how it all began. Being a man of adventure and wanting to make something of himself, he rapidly became a manager, part owner of a couple of cattle companies, and then he was able to graze his growing herds on Indian land because of Sally, and he became a part owner of a bank, a politician, a big man in central South Dakota. Then a gentleman in the northwest corner of the state, Pete Dupree, died and left a small herd of buffalo. Now, this was at the time when the big thing to do was to come out on a train and shoot buffalo from the train cars, leave them to rot on the prairie. This did not sit well with Sarah because she was Native American, or with Pete Dupree's wife because she was Native American as well. And the story is that they put pressure on their husbands to get some of these buffalo and, for all practical purposes, save the buffalo from extinction. So Scottie and several of his hands, one of whom was my grandfather, went up to Dupree and drove buffalo down, which I have to think is sort of like hiking through Jello or herding cats. I don't think it was an easy trip, but he got them down here, and the herd grew and grew, and he built a huge, very heavy buffalo fence around these many acres. And as the herd grew and his prominence grew and people began to realize that for all practical purposes he was the patron saint of the buffalo, he became very well known. And at that point, then a nephew of Scottie's, who was born near where he was in Scotland, but it didn't really matter because the families were large and they were spread all over. But my grandpa was orphaned at 3. Well, his father died at 3. His mother died soon after. He was taken care of by his grandparents, and it went well, but how much fun is that? It was finally decided by the Greater family that he would be apprenticed to be a ship's engineer. That lasted not so long, and he realized, I'm not really cut out for this. The problem was he had a 5-year apprenticeship, and he's 16. And we're not loving this. And he had to figure out a way to break the apprenticeship legally. So he thought that what he ought to do is cultivate a really attention-grabbing cough, which he did. And the doctors kept saying, "What's wrong with you?" Philip, "Nothing, I am healthy," which was true. The cough was a lie. Well, ultimately, the doctor said, "I really think you need a year's rest. How about Transvaal, South Africa, or the United States?" The United States sounded like just the deal. So he got on a ship, came to Kansas, gathered in with the family, and after a year on the ranch in Kansas thought that wasn't going to be good. So being young and foolish, he then went to Colorado, worked in a lumber camp for a year, which is not fun, and thought this is not a good plan. But Scottie had heard that his nephew was in the area, somehow or other a letter reached my grandpa from Scotty saying, hey, if you need a job, come on up, I'll put you to work. And that's really where the story begins. George Phillip arrived in Fort Pierre wondering, what do I do now? And as he was walking down the street, ran into Scotty, whom he had seen only once before at a family wedding. And he said, hello there, I'm George. I'm coming in response to your letter. Wonderful, said Scotty, probably. And he said, come with me, got him set up with a horse, introduced him to the men he was going to work with, gave him a bedroll and said, you know, follow those men. And out they went to work with the herds. And at that time, Scotty was bringing in a fair amount of cattle from Texas on the train. There were times when my Grandpa George and the other men were down in the rail yards working the cattle there, or they'd bring the cattle, take them up to pasture, you know, do what people do with cattle, which is follow them around and say good cow or whatever. Any rate, so he did that for 4 years. But in the time span of those 4 years, keep in mind there were no fences. There were very few roads. The map was the stars and the creeks. You would follow the water downhill until you knew where you were. And there were other home ranch houses, but they were far between. But you got to know the topography, and his travels with the cattle took him almost to the North Dakota line and down into the northwestern part of Nebraska. All of this with his string of horses, which would be about 10 animals that would move with the cattle, and the men he was working with. And they would herd the horses, they would herd the cattle, they'd round them up at night, they'd cut them out for branding, or if they were catching the horses in the spring, they'd geld the stallions. And it was just pretty typical ranch work, except there wasn't really a ranch. There were rolling prairies and ravines and rivers and things like that. By 1931, he had his 2 grown sons were in the military, and by 1936, it became very clear to here and the rest of the world that things were not going well in Europe. And he, I suppose, taking a personal inventory, as we all do, realized it was really important to him that his children understand these years on the prairie. Because while at the very end of his time on the prairie, which would have been 1902 or 1903, for all practical purposes, the great open range was closing. Barbed wire was coming up, roads were happening. The life that he knew was gone. And he felt a lot of the experiences, a lot of the knowledge, a lot of the people who were part of that were going to be forgotten. His children knew of his Western history, but not really. So he began to write these long letters to his children. And because he wanted them to understand what he called himself an ordinary man. Well, it's obvious by the end that there was nothing ordinary about my grandfather at all. He was exceptional in many ways, but he wanted them to know what his experiences had been. And he would write these letters as time allowed. Some letters would be just one incident. Some would be funny. Some would be not so funny. Some would be poignant. And one of the really fine things that I think my grandfather did in the letters, which comprise the book, is he, in many places, he says to his children, because these were originally letters he wrote to his adult children, he said, you need to understand the real cowboys were not tinseled and spent their time in bars and shot everyone they saw. He said it wasn't like that. The cowboys were young and they worked hard and they lived hard, and you slept outside under the stars or under the clouds or under the wagon if it was raining. And it was a hard life, and you were in the saddle 18, 20, 24 hours or more a day as the situation demanded. And these were, you know, his statement was these were fine men, not always educated, but always fine, thoroughbred people, trustable, knowledgeable, experienced. And he said the tragedy is, and he wanted to remedy that the names of some of these truly wonderful men, skilled men, who built the West that we are familiar with, he said, are going to be lost to history because there's no one here to write it. And I think he set a personal task to do some of that writing. Everything that is started in life should have a purpose. So he explains his purpose. Mine in undertaking this letter, and such others as may follow, is to chronicle the uneventful story of an unimportant man, and to give each of you some idea of the experiences an ordinary chap could have in a generation that preceded yours. He was palpably aware of the change to the land and what it would do to society when the open range closed. And I think he really wanted that sense of closure and change to be something his children could recognize and hopefully absorb, that life does that to you. You have these moments of ecstasy or periods of ecstasy. Then there's a time of reckoning where you gather all that into yourself, and then you open up into something new. I think that's what he was doing.